Hi, my name is Fiona Davis. I'm an educational psychologist, and for my doctoral thesis, I looked at adolescent masculinity and homophobic aggression. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about one of the two papers of my thesis, this one being the empirical study that I did. And with thanks, as always, to Cora and Sarah, my supervisors. So an overview of this paper. It proposes a new model for understanding how fragile masculinity leads to homophobic aggression in adolescence. It is a novel hypothesis that fragile masculinity functions in a similar way to narcissism. And also we'll talk about the role that empathy plays in this relationship between masculinity and homophobic aggression. We'll start by looking at and defining masculinity. So the definition of masculinity changes as society changes, but the one thing that's remained constant is the need to prove it. And here are the characteristics of today's stereotypical masculinity. The most important characteristic for my study being the idea of anti-femininity. So this is the need to avoid appearances of weakness or showing emotions, particularly vulnerable emotions. And due to heteronormative assumptions, sexuality and gender are often incorrectly conflated, so an avoidance of femininity also includes an avoidance of homosexuality. Research suggests that there's an enduring link between masculinity and homophobia, but importantly, research suggests that it's not a fear of gay men that drives this homophobia, but a fear of being perceived as insufficiently masculine by other men. A quick note about homophobic aggression and name-calling in adolescence. So I also conducted a systematic review of meta-analysis as part of my thesis, and this concluded that boys often use homophobic name-calling as a way to police masculinity and encourage conformity to traditional forms of masculinity within friendship groups, rather than always as a direct homophobic aggression or bullying act. This name-calling is often directed at peers they do not believe to be gay, and perpetrators don't always view themselves or their behaviour as homophobic. So what is fragile masculinity specifically? Masculinity is fragile as it's highly valued in society, but it's narrowly defined, so true conformity is likely to be impossible. This results in a continuous need to prove one's masculinity, which has been described in the Precarious Manhood theory. This theory is based on these three basic principles. First, that masculinity is a status that must be earned. Second, that once earned, it can be easily lost. And thirdly, masculinity must be socially proven, as it's confirmed by other people rather than confirmed by the self. Although men are motivated to continuously strive towards these unattainable standards of masculinity, due to its fragility, masculinity is under constant threat. So what happens when someone's masculinity is constantly under threat? When a value component of a person's identity is threatened, research shows that they react with extreme or exaggerated attitudes and behaviours associated with that valued identity in an attempt to recover it. And the same is true for masculinity, and this has been named the masculine overcompensation thesis. So threatening masculinity in a controlled experimental setting has been found to increase anger, sexism, and sexualization of women. But most importantly for my study, it also increases aggression and negative attitudes towards gay people and more amusement and use of homophobic jokes. Masculinity threat on a societal level is also associated with homophobic attitudes. So overall, masculinity threat increases aggression and homophobia. There's an interesting and under-researched link between masculinity threat and empathy. So one study found that following masculinity threat, men showed less empathy and perspective taking compared to when their masculinity was assured. And researchers suggest that this is because empathy is often considered a feminine emotion, and therefore men are motivated to avoid it when their masculinity has been threatened due to the overcompensation thesis. And other research has found similar. But as high empathy is a protective factor against aggression, this suppression of empathy in the face of masculinity threat might contribute to the aggression and antisocial reactions to masculinity threat. So where does narcissism come in? This is a quick definition of narcissism. Most importantly, it's characterized by a grandiose sense of self, manipulation, and lack of empathy, and a need for admiration. In my research, I propose that fragile masculinity functions in a similar way to narcissism, and this results in homophobic aggression. And this slide illustrates the similarities between the two. So both narcissism and fragile masculinity require maintenance to sustain this desired self-concept. Narcissists have a fragile self-esteem characterized by inflated self-views, and these are easily threatened and vulnerable to negative feedback from others. And research suggests that they have a dual processing model of self-esteem, in that they have high explicit self-esteem and low implicit self-esteem. And I think this might also be the case in fragile masculinity, as if masculinity is highly valued in society, it would follow that they have high explicit self-esteem. But because masculine standards are almost impossible to attain, they may have low implicit self-esteem. Both concepts are associated with low empathy. Narcissism may not be driven by an excessive self-love, as was originally thought, but rather a fear of the undesired self. And similarly, as previously mentioned, homophobia in fragile masculinity is a fear of being perceived as insufficiently masculine, rather than a fear of gay men. Importantly, both react with aggression when their self-concept is threatened, and in narcissism this leads to bullying, and in fragile masculinity it's related to the masculine overcompensation thesis. So my current study. The research questions were as follows. Is fragile masculinity related to homophobic aggression in adolescence? Do adolescent boys experience masculinity threat? And does fragile masculinity function in a similar way to narcissism? It's the method. So we had 226 participants between the ages of 12 and 19, and they were all from one secondary school, and they all answered an online questionnaire. The measures that we used, we measured adolescent masculinity, homophobic aggression attitudes, empathy, sexism, and self-esteem. And the analysis, we did group comparisons, correlation, multiple linear regression, mediation, and moderation. So the results. First, we looked at whether masculinity is related to homophobic aggression in adolescence, as previous research suggests. So we did a multiple linear regression with just the boys' data to see what factors would predict homophobic aggression. As you can see here, higher scores in masculinity significantly predicted higher scores in homophobic aggression, which is in line with previous research. It's unsurprising that attitudes also predicted aggression. Our second multiple regression analysis showed that, similarly, masculinity significantly predicted homophobic attitudes. And this leads us on to the mediation analysis. This mediation analysis, again just for the boys' data, shows that one route from masculinity to homophobic aggression is via homophobic attitudes. This analysis found a partial mediation, so boys who scored higher on masculinity scored higher on homophobic attitudes, which predicted higher levels of homophobic aggression. So although my systematic review showed that boys use homophobic name-calling as a policing of masculinity and don't believe it to be homophobic, this analysis actually showed the opposite, that is indeed sometimes, but maybe not always, homophobic. The second research question was, do adolescent boys experience masculinity threat? We didn't measure this experimentally, but this study does add weight to this hypothesis that boys do experience masculinity threat on a societal level, similar to men. So the findings that support this are that boys scored significantly higher than girls on homophobic attitudes and aggression, and this homophobic aggression included homophobic name-calling and jokes. And as we saw earlier, men whose masculinity has been threatened tended to use more homophobic jokes. Boys also scored higher on levels of sexism than girls, again in line with previous research. And masculinity was significantly correlated with sexism, homophobic attitudes, and homophobic aggression. The last research question was, does fragile masculinity function in a similar way to narcissism? To explore this hypothesis, we looked at self-esteem and empathy, which are two important constructs in narcissism. Firstly, self-esteem. We found that masculinity correlated with self-esteem, indicating that those high in masculinity also had greater explicit self-esteem, which is similar to narcissism. Empathy. In this study, high masculinity correlated with low empathy, and in particular low affective empathy, which is again similar to narcissism. Similarly, the regression analysis in this study showed that low empathy could significantly predict homophobic aggression in boys. To further explore this hypothesis, we conducted a moderation analysis with empathy as the moderators. And the results indicate that affective empathy most strengthens the relationship between masculinity and homophobic aggression in the context of high cognitive empathy. So this may suggest that knowing how to hurt others, cognitive empathy, while not feeling the effects themselves, affective empathy, may contribute to the relationship between masculinity and homophobic aggression, which suggests a similar mechanism to the relationship between narcissism and bullying. So a summary of our proposed model of how fragile masculinity functions in a similar way to narcissism, and then consequently leads to homophobic aggression. So as you can see, narcissism is associated with low empathy. Narcissists are motivated to use more cognitive resources on maintaining their desired self rather than on showing empathy towards others, which leads to this lack of empathy. And this lack of empathy in narcissists is related to aggression and bullying. And the findings of this study suggest a similar relationship between empathy and bullying for fragile masculinity as well. However, the relationship goes one step further. So fragile masculinity also takes up cognitive resources on maintaining the desired masculine self-concept, which reduces empathy. But due to masculinity threat, they are also further motivated to avoid empathy, as it is stereotypically coded as a feminine emotion. And this lack of empathy again results in aggression, like in narcissism. However, in fragile masculinity, this relationship results specifically in homophobic aggression, and this is due to masculinity threat again, resulting in the need for men and boys to show extreme attitudes and behaviours associated with masculinity, which includes homophobic attitudes. In our analysis, we also created a final model which was theoretically guided and combines the findings from the mediation and moderation models and the linear regression analysis. So this path model illustrates the two mechanisms underlying the relationship between fragile masculinity and homophobic aggression. Firstly, the route from masculinity to homophobic aggression via homophobic attitudes, and then secondly, the link to narcissism. Masculinity significantly predicted homophobic aggression, and this was moderated by affective empathy, and low cognitive empathy significantly predicted high homophobic aggression. So some strengths and limitations. Strengths were that it was a novel theory and model, and it adds to our understanding of what leads to homophobic aggression and bullying. Limitations, it was only conducted in one school and relied on self-report measures which are susceptible to social desirability bias. Obviously, more research is needed. Some interesting areas may be to experimentally manipulate masculinity threat in adolescence. And research about empathy as a potential protective factor against homophobic aggression would also be really interesting. So the implications and conclusions. This is a new model which adds to our understanding. Homophobia and homophobic bullying are still present in schools, but empathy plays an important role, and it may be a protective factor which could be used as an area for intervention or for future research. That was the empirical paper of my thesis. If you're interested in the systematic review and meta-analysis, I've also made a video about that. If you have any questions, my email is here. Otherwise, thank you so much for listening.